Our first reading today comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 60, verses 1 through 6. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be carried on their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. Our second reading today comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who's been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it's been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road.
Would you pray with me, please? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your presence. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It came at a steep cost, but it was so worth it. I don't know if you've ever sat on a camel, but they are not exactly comfortable or friendly. Their gait is not exactly smooth and soothing. In fact, they are rather cranky and they are known to spit. And those magi rode the camels, day in and day out for weeks, months, maybe, a journey of hundreds of miles across the desert. And it wasn't just the camels. They had to pack supplies for a journey of that magnitude, supplies for themselves, supplies for the camels, supplies for the people who would lead the caravan of camels carrying the supplies. They had to make arrangements for things at home, had to say farewell to their families and friends and colleagues and clients to depart for God only knew how long. They had to find their way through a landscape that was traveled only when necessary by armies and trading caravans and the bandits who preyed upon them. They had to contend with wild animals who would have been only too glad to devour them. They had to stop when sandstorms blew up, wind whipping the sand until it blocked out the sun and stung their faces and filled every uncovered pore and orifice with grit that never came out. They had to keep their skin covered in spite of the heat, or else they would have baked to a sunburned crisp during the day, and at night they had to wrap themselves more tightly still as the heat of the day poured into the cloudless night sky and left them shivering under that star of wonder, star of light. Finally, they crossed into Palestine, Israel, and found their way to Jerusalem, where they asked directions at Herod's palace, assuming that someone in that royal household must have been aware that a new king was being born in the neighborhood. Those magi earned their title of wise men when they sussed out something suspicious in Herod's request for news of the baby's location, and they managed to extricate themselves from his presence while neither giving away any further information nor provoking his ire. When at last they made it to Bethlehem and found the place where the child was, they broke out their treasure chests, which must surely have come as a relief to the camels who had been tasked with carrying them, and they offered their gifts to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And even if gold and frankincense and myrrh are not exactly baby shower approved, it must nevertheless have been a pretty magical moment. Meeting a newborn freshly arrived in this world is miraculous enough in and of itself. Meeting God incarnate, the creator of heaven and earth in human form, divine love wrapped in flesh, the one whose arrival they had foreseen in the stars, even as Gentiles from worlds away. Well, that was worth all the treasure any caravan could carry, and then some. And knowing what they had discerned about Herod and having their suspicions confirmed in a spirit-filled dream, they departed to return to their own country by another road, and they went knowing that they had done what they could to protect that child from those who were already scheming to destroy him and the all-transforming love he embodied. I imagine that they bore the hardships of the return trip gladly, still carrying within them the warmth and glow of that encounter with divine love infleshed. It turns out that incarnation really matters. It came at a steep cost, but it was so worth it. It had been months already of isolation, months of not visiting their friends, not seeing their loved ones, interactions all mediated by a screen. Months without worshiping in their favorite pew in the church sanctuary, or reading in their favorite chair at the library, or sitting in their favorite seats at the theater or the concert hall. Months without a real haircut or a meal at a restaurant or a workout on their favorite equipment at the gym. Months of Zoom meetings and remote school assignments, telehealth appointments, web-based portals, Peapod and Instacart and Amazon. Months of not singing together or hugging one another, or enjoying a friendly, spontaneous conversation without worrying about how many feet were between them or how many minutes they had been together or how often the mask had slipped off someone's nose. Months of worrying for loved ones who had tested positive, gathering for memorial services on Zoom, thanking God for the ones who survived, praying for the ones whose recovery turned into a long haul. At first, they thought it would just be a few weeks. Then the weeks dragged on into months, and the months began to feel like years, and time blurred together into an undifferentiated slog that seemed like it might never end. There were glimmers of hope. The photos of the first people to receive the vaccine, the reports that other formulas might soon be approved for use as well. But the toll kept climbing, and the leaders who told the truth acknowledged that it was going to get worse before it got better. It was so hard to miss the holiday traditions they loved, the familiar rituals and experiences and gatherings that gave shape and meaning to the season. And they knew it would be a while yet before it would be safe again to gather as they longed to do, but they held on steadfastly to what they knew was right. They listened to the public health advice, they kept their distance and wore their masks and washed their hands and stayed home because they knew how glorious it was going to be When they could at last feel the touch of an embrace from someone outside their immediate household, they knew how joyous it was going to be. When they could at last go out to lunch with friends without worry or fear, they knew how miraculous it was going to be when they could at last be together in person for worship and lift their voices together in song. And they wanted as many people as possible to be around to enjoy that encounter with divine love enfleshed. It turns out that incarnation really matters. It came at a steep cost, but it was so worth it. It was a long and costly journey, from infinite to limited, from omnipotent to vulnerable, from omniscient to fallible, from ethereal to earthly. God's choice to become incarnate meant God had to relinquish the power and might that separated God from the creation God so loves. God had to give up being protected afar on high. God had to take on a form in which God would be subject to the actions and decisions of other human beings. God had to experience suffering and pain, skinned knees and broken bones, viral infections, and violent afflictions. God had to relinquish immortality and become subject even to death itself. God had to experience the brutal force of systemic power wielded by leaders with little concern for the welfare of the last and the lost and the least and the lowly. God had to bear in God's own body the violence of hate that clings to power. Because to be fully human means to experience all these things: limitation and failure and error and hurt and heartbreak and grief and vulnerability and oppression. And God wanted more than anything for God's beloved human creatures to know that even the trials and tribulations of mortal existence are known to God, are shared by God, cannot separate us from God. And even the worst suffering we can experience, even the inhuman things we humans do to one another, cannot hold a candle to the strength and the power and the overwhelming grace of God's love. It wasn't enough for God and God's people to know one another from afar through rainbows and smoke, flying doves and whispering wind, vivid dreams and prophetic visions, thunder and earthquake and still small voice. It wasn't enough to be connected from afar through pixels on a screen and voices on a phone, through stars in the sky and promises foretold. God chose to show up in the flesh, and divine love enfleshed changed everything. It turns out that incarnation really, really matters. Amen.